Tonight on Nation to Nation, Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay calls retiring RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki's plan to root out systemic racism in the force a failure.
But I would say it's the whole institution which has failed. I'm not entirely sure how much influence she actually had.
Dr. Kimberly Murray calls into question the cultural competence of a foreign agency that's advising Ottawa on what to do next after the discovery of hundreds of possible unmarked graves near former residential schools.
It is an agency that is mostly white. All the commissioners are white. All the experts on the Forensic Science Board are white.
Indigenous women still go missing and are being murdered, even after years of effort and publicity. An NDP MP proposes a new tool, the Red Dress Alert.
We are valuable, and when our loved ones go missing, we need an immediate response.
Ani, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. Just over a week ago, Brenda Lucki announced she would be retiring as head of the RCMP next month. Lucki has made history as the first female commissioner. She's served 5 years. It was a term filled with controversy, criticism, and accusations of systemic racism that's still rooted within the force. Rose LeMay is a columnist for the Hill Times. Her latest article was titled "The RCMP is Never Held to Account for Its Own Tragic, Devastating Wrongdoing." Ms. LeMay joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So what has been the consequences of the RCMP not being held to account?
Well, given that it's a national force, if it is not held accountable, it sets a pretty low standard for police forces across the country. But the other issue is that it's in so many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across the country, and it is likely the first point of contact that many communities have for any kind of issue that needs police, and it raises a whole bunch of questions about levels of trust, levels of effective service for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I think the harms are immeasurable at this point.
So in your latest article, you described the action the RCMP officers in Saskatchewan had when they were dealing with the search for an Indigenous woman. Her name was Amanda McCalloch. Can you describe the RCMP's actions or inactions?
So what I understand is that Amanda and a family member were out getting wood one evening in the cold, dark winter of Saskatchewan, and she went missing. And so the family member went back and called the police, called the RCMP, come help us search. And in the resulting hours after that, the police officers who were involved seemed to have found all sorts of reasons to not believe the story, the fact that she was missing. And it seems that they picked up on that perhaps she had went to a bar, which I don't know who, very few of us haven't, and somehow they decided that therefore she wasn't worth searching for. She also appeared to be not white to them, whether it was a tan or they assumed that she was Métis, and that also got in the way of their ability to do good service, and they probably did what might be called a breach of service. They did not a breach of duty, and they did not search for her. So community members showed up and searched and found the woman within a very short period of time, and unfortunately she had passed due to hypothermia. Those two police officers received no criminal charges for breach of duty. Sounds like they went into some kind of performance review, and in my world that ends up with maybe a note on your file. There really was no consequence for them at all.
How do you think they should have been dealt with?
Well, I think the police should be held to a higher standard. They should have gone out to search, they have called in help, they should have made it an alert, other people would have been looking for her, and instead it seems they did nothing. So do I think they should have been charged for breach of duty? Yes, I do.
Brenda Lucki was supposed to have dealt or be dealing with systemic racism within the system. Has she failed?
I can't figure out any kind of argument to say that she hasn't. Has she failed? Yes, but I would say it's the whole institution which has failed. I'm not entirely sure how much influence she actually had. And I think that's a failure of the organization as well. Was it her failure that she didn't have much influence? I don't really know. That story is yet to be told.
Systemic racism is embedded within the system. How do you deal with that?
I prefer institutional racism, same thing. We can call it also systemic racism. How do we deal with it? We name it. As in any problem, we need to name it in order to deal with it. The RCMP has been incredibly resistant to thinking about it, admitting it, and so we're not even there yet that they are willing to even admit that systemic racism is in play. Do all sorts of people around, everybody from Senator Kim Pate to all sorts of people do. Have they? No. Can we fix it without them admitting it? It's going to take some pretty serious shifts of power for us to do that.
You've suggested that the next commissioner be brought in from an outside force. What would that mean, and should it be an Indigenous person?
Well, I do think it's time for an Indigenous commissioner. I really do. It's a sign of this government could make a significant sign for reconciliation in doing that, and also show a level of understanding of what role the RCMP has played in taking kids away to institutions, to allowing missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls to go on for so long. It would be a significant move. I say the commissioner should come from outside the organization, because what I know of change management organizations, that when an organization gets so kind of embedded in its dysfunction, it's incredibly difficult to fix it from within, and sometimes you need that outside voice to really shine a light and create some energy from change.
What are the chances that would happen?
What are the chances? I'd say they're pretty low. We have so many pressures on this government at this point. I'm not entirely sure that the crisis within the RCMP is rising to the top of their top 5 crises in which to deal with, which is really unfortunate, because I think it is a top crisis for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have to interact with the RCMP, who have to go back over and over and over again to ask them to do their due diligence. So I think it's a matter of perception as a crisis. It is very much a crisis for those families who are still looking for missing and murdered family members.
What about First Nations run police on reserve? Should RCMP be brought out of First Nations and be replaced?
Well, there's some options there. As with every community-based decision, I can't say for a community whether or not their own force would be better than others. But there is that principle of community-based policing, which has a lot going for it, meaning that the police feel like they're also part of the community. The RCMP doesn't have that. They shift and move around to different locations so often that they just can't do community-based policing. They don't feel that sense of onus that they're part of community. But community-based police forces have something that other police forces don't have. It's hard to measure, but it really is there, and you can see it, you can feel it when it's there.
There are problems within the Indigenous police services as well. A female officer serving with the Anishinaabe-Aski Police has recently filed a human rights complaint claiming sexual assault by another police officer. How do you think those issues in the North should be dealt with?
Well, I think that those issues in any location, north, south, east or west, urban, rural, need to be dealt with decisively. We need to build those levels of safety for people who feel at risk, be it women, be because of race or culture or gender orientation. There should not be a time and a place within what is supposed to be a professional organization, police forces, that any one individual feels unsafe. It should be dealt with decisively.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Miigwech, for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
After the break, Dr. Kimberly Murray will be here to tell us her concerns about hiring a foreign agency to advise the government about unmarked graves. Welcome back. Hundreds of possible unmarked graves have been located near former residential schools over the past few years. But now that they've been located, what's the next steps? A few weeks ago, the federal government hired an international organization to give them technical advice on how to move forward. It's a Dutch-based agency called the International Commission on Missing Persons, or ICMP. Dr. Kimberly Murray has concerns about the $2 million deal that was awarded for this work. She is the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves. Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Miigwech, thank you.
What do you see that's wrong with the federal government getting all the help that it can on this issue?
Well, I would say that my number one concern is the process that was utilized to engage the ICMP. They did that without consulting with any Indigenous people or communities or survivors. So it was sort of a deal that they did behind closed doors. And when it came to my attention, I immediately contacted both the ICMP and Canada saying, you need to make that agreement public. We need to see what you're bringing this organization in to do. And there was a little pushback on that. But they've now made the agreement public. It is on the ICMP's website. And I have concerns when I look at the agreement now that we've been able to look at it. I'm not sure that communities and survivors understand exactly what they're being brought in to do here in Canada.
What is the harm, and what are some of those other concerns that you have?
Well, when we look at the agreement, it's completely led by Canada, by CERNAC. Canada decides and tells the ICMP who they're to engage with. Canada has the right to attend every single meeting that the ICMP holds. All the reporting of any engagement sessions goes directly to Canada, not to survivors, not to communities. There's no parallel reporting out to communities and leadership. There's a report that's due in June of 2023, so that's not far from now. And that report gets to go to Canada for a review to make edits before the final report is delivered to Canada. Again, there's no provision for it to be delivered publicly to Indigenous communities or survivors. So it's, I think that's problematic. There's no transparency. We have just paid, Canada's just paid $2.2 million to get an assessment from the International Commission of Missing Persons. It has not paid $2.2 million to have them come here and help communities that want to do exhumation right now. So I think there's a little miscommunicating about what the process is that they're taking. And finally, I do have a lot of concerns that they don't have any competency, cultural competency, legal competency in relation to Indigenous people within Canada. It is an agency that is mostly white. All the commissioners are white. All the experts on the Forensic Science Board are white. And so I question whether they're going to have the capability to apply Indigenous law and protocols to the important work that they have to do. All that to say, though, they do have great expertise in DNA testing. And so it's just really important that they get properly trained before they start engaging with people within Canada.
You've raised your concerns with Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller. What's been the response there?
I raised my concerns in a written format and over a telephone meeting. I also raised my concerns yesterday with the Minister of Justice. I have been assured that the timeline will be changed and that the reporting of June 23rd will be extended, because there's absolutely no way that they can do the number of community engagement sessions that the contract says they're to do. 35 is what it says. So I've been told that that will be changed. I am still pushing for changes in relation to the public reporting and the involvement of CERNAC at every step of the way.
One chief, Derek Niepenak of the Pine Creek First Nation in Manitoba, has said he would welcome advice from the international agency. What are you hearing from the other communities?
I think that all communities want to have a tool and welcome the advice and expertise that some of these agencies have. There are other agencies internationally that can do this work. So I'm not trying to get in the way of that happening. But how come Chief Niepenak isn't having direct communication with the International Commission on Missing Persons? Why do we require Canada to be the middle person for those communications. Canada should pay for it, and communities should be allowed to engage with the Commission as they need and if they want to engage with the Commission. We don't need bureaucrats of CERNAC being in the middle, dictating how the process will play out.
You're doing your own report on missing children and unmarked graves. Is there not risk of duplicating that work that the ICMP is doing?
There is some duplication when we look at the contract that Canada has entered into, and I raised that duplication with Minister LeMay yesterday. If the ICMP sticks to what they do best, science and DNA testing, then there's no overlap. But when we look at their agreement, they're talking about archives, they're talking about doing research on Indian residential schools. Again, I don't know why we need an international white organization to come in and do that type of work. So I think that there needs to be some amendments and some scoping of the work that they need to do. We also have a national advisory committee made up of Indigenous people that Canada implemented that is made up of Indigenous anthropologists, archaeologists, archivists, and it seems that somehow we're forgetting about those individuals and their expertise, and we have to turn to a non-Indigenous entity to do this work. So it's going to cause confusion, I think, and potential for conflicting reports, definitely. So there's some conversations that we need to have with the Department of Justice and CERNAC.
What's the possibility of collaborating with the ICMP?
Oh, I mean, obviously there's possibility of collaboration, but I don't want to get involved in a process that is flawed. So I want to fix the process, and then I'll get involved and cooperate and work together with the ICMP. But we need to fix that contract first.
Okay. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
After the break, NDP MP Leah Gazan tells us why red dress alerts are needed. Welcome back. Over the past few decades, there have been protests, calls to action, campaigns, and a national inquiry. But we seem no closer than ever to lowering the amount of Indigenous women and girls who are murdered or go missing. This week in Winnipeg, NDP MP Leah Gazan urges that more action needs to be done. So she suggests creating an alert designed specifically for Indigenous women. She says it could save lives. She joins us now. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Gazan.
Thank you so much for having me.
So describe the red dress alert and how it would work.
Well, very much like an Amber Alert that we see with children, a red dress alert would alert the public when an Indigenous woman, girl, and two-spirit person went missing, much like we see for warnings when we see storm warnings, but also for children who have gone missing. So, the idea it would work similarly.
Okay. You've written Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino. What's been the response there?
I have heard from the Parliamentary Secretary, Pam Dumoff, which I appreciated. However, this federal government released $724.1 million for a violence prevention strategy that was supposed to address this ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls. We're now 2023. They've spent 5% of it. So although the government seems to be supportive of this initiative, I am urging them immediately to take action, including with putting in place a red dress alert.
Yeah. What are the families saying about this alert?
Well, I was joined today by Sandra Delaron, who has been involved with the MMIWG 2S Plus implementation committee in the province of Manitoba to address the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And there's, pretty much unanimous consent that when Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people go missing, the response is inadequate. It continues to be inadequate. We need to change that. We are valuable. And when our loved ones go missing, we need an immediate response.
You have consistently called for more resources for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In December, you stood on Parliament Hill with the families asking for money for searches and for the Red Dress Alert, and more recently in the House of Commons. How is the federal government dealing with this crisis, and is there another immediate action that could be taken now?
Well, I don't think the federal government is dealing with this crisis, quite frankly. I mean, the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, acknowledged that this was an ongoing genocide, yet, put forward, like I said, $724.1 million that was supposed to go towards putting in place program services, including building shelters and transitional homes for women fleeing violence to ensure that women are safe. We are now 2023. They put zero in the 2022 budget to address this ongoing genocide. They've spent 5% of monies that were allocated in 2020, in spite of the fact that we know that rates of violence are rapidly increasing. That is why I along with our party, continues to press the government to take immediate action, including to put in place a red dress alert.
Changing subjects, you've proposed the extension of criminal code provisions on hate speech to include denialism of the genocide committed in residential schools. Why is that necessary and doesn't infringe on freedom of speech?
Well, I think, it's important to acknowledge that, just a couple of months ago at the House of Commons, members of Parliament unanimously supported the motion recognizing what happened in residential school as an act of genocide, as defined under the UN Convention on Genocide. So that finding has been acknowledged. We know there's a difference between hate speech and freedom of speech. In fact, Justice Rouleau, in his ruling around the convoy, concluded the exact same findings. We have to be careful. I certainly support freedom of speech. I, however, do not support hate speech. And we know with certainly some of the rhetoric coming out from, for example, the Frontier Center, that we need to put in place legislation very similar to what has happened to place the Holocaust denial under 319 of the Criminal Code. We need something similar for residential school denial in this country.
There is increasing opposition to the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister entering into a $2 million technical agreement with an international company to give advice on searching unmarked graves near former residential schools. What's your position on this?
Well, look, I think, there's a circle of survivors and there's a national advisory body that was put in place, including an independent interlocutor that was supposed to oversee the searching of graves, I think, or of unmarked graves. I think the fact that the minister chose to kind of go over the heads of certainly survivors, something that looks like interfering with the independent arm that they had put in place with the special interlocutor is troubling, and it needs to be addressed immediately.
Okay. Miigwech, that's all the questions I have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Take care.
That's it for this week's Nation to Nation. And if you missed any parts of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Have a good evening. We'll see you next week.